dying patients who may be suffering. How will the government respond if the Supreme Court turns down its request? Two experts will take on that heated debate, emotional debate really, later in the show. But right now, let's hear from some MPs. Joining us from Charlottetown today, Sean Casey is the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice. In Edmonton, Michael Cooper is the Conservative Deputy Justice Critic. And in Victoria tonight, Murray Rankin is the NDP Justice Critic. Coast to coast today. Good to see you, gentlemen. Sean Casey, obviously we're going to start with you. Just explain to viewers why the Liberal government needs 6 more months to come up with a response to this Supreme Court decision.
With an issue as complex and as deeply personal as physician-assisted death, it's absolutely critical that there be a comprehensive and integrated legislative framework, that it be consistent across the country, and that there be consultations between the provinces and the federal government in order to ensure that happens. So this is really as much about the provinces being ready as it is for the federal government crafting its legislation. With the 1-year suspension of the implementation of the decision granted last February, the fact that Parliament hasn't sat much since that happened, the intervention of the federal election, and there is much to be done both at the federal and the provincial level in terms of coordinating the efforts and working collaboratively to make sure that there isn't across the country uncertainty and inconsistency in relation to the legislative provisions that pertain to this very complex issue.
Okay, there's lots of little pieces there that I want to pull out, but let's just get everybody to do a go around on where they sit on whether an extension is needed or not. Michael Cooper, the official opposition says what in response to the request for an extension of 6 months?
Well, we have to recognize that this is a very, very sensitive issue in which there are a diverse range of viewpoints from people of good faith. So I think having regard for the fact that it is multifaceted and the underlying complexity surrounding the matter, that asking for a 6-month extension is reasonable in the circumstances.
And how about you, Murray Rankin? Where does the NDP sit on this?
Well, we wouldn't be here if the Conservatives hadn't dragged the puck until the middle of the summer, when then they called the election 3 weeks later. So obviously our back's against the wall as parliamentarians. I worry about the people who are suffering right now. And I'm wondering about whether a constitutional exemption, which the trial level judge thought could be mandated, where you go to the court and seek relief, isn't a possible way to make this work.
Okay, so let's put that to Sean Casey. Do you think that if you get the 6 months, that would be something the government would be willing to consider, that on a case-by-case basis, someone could go to a court and ask for an exemption to the legislation in order to be able to proceed with something that the Supreme Court has said you're allowed to do? It's just a matter of what kind of guidelines the government wants to put in place.
I think the more appropriate route to take is exactly the one that we've chosen, and that is to get to seek the 6-month extension, to have some hard timelines for the special joint committee to come back with its recommendations. The timeline is February 26th.
So is that a no? You wouldn't be open to exemptions? That's how I'm reading that response.
What I would say to you is that we've chosen a course of action, and that I believe is the best course of action, and that's the one that we're committed to.
Okay, but then there is some contradictions in what you're saying, and Alison Crawford talked about them there. Your government lawyers are arguing that this would not apply to Quebec. So why would the federal government need 6 months to come up with guidelines, but allow Quebec to proceed with its own law on assisted suicide?
Well, look, there are actually 6 provinces. Quebec has actually gone the extra step of implementing a law, and will certainly take guidance and refer to the law that's been implemented in the course of our interprovincial consultations in coming up with something. But there are 6 provinces that have drafted guidelines, but that means that there are 4 who haven't and 3 territories who haven't. So they're right now, and for the foreseeable future, until we work through this 6-month period of dealing with the provinces, there is very much a void in parts of this country.
Yeah, but my point is that in Quebec, people will be allowed to go to their doctors and seek physician-assisted suicide, while the rest of the country will have to wait.
Right.
Well, that very point came up in the hearings today, and it's and the government of Canada has supported Quebec in the fact that they've already taken the steps that were that were necessary to implement the law. So that is the position that was presented to the court today.
Michael Cooper, where do you sit on the issue of exemptions? You know, if the 6-month extension is granted, or a shorter extension, do you think that people who are in these situations, who want to be able to use this right that the Supreme Court has said they have, that they should be allowed to take their individual cases to court in order to proceed?
It's very curious that the federal government is effectively ceding its criminal lawmaking power to Quebec by virtue of that announcement today. But look, what we have are two criminal code provisions, Section 241 sub B and Section 14, which the Supreme Court determined to be overbroad and consequently were in contravention of Section 7. That falls within the domain of Parliament. And what is important is that the committee get to work as soon as possible, proceed in a way that is cautious and sensitive, and consults as broadly as possible.
Right, but isn't that something the Conservative government already did? Why would you be interested in hearing from more people, given that the Conservative government, of which you weren't a part at the time, already did all of this work? What's the point?
I think there's still a tremendous amount to be fleshed out. And again, 6 months is not really all that much more time to go through that process. And hopefully what we can have is a recommendation to the government that deals with the decision and at the same time protects vulnerable people.
But it's just intolerable that we'd have a situation where one part of the country has their constitutional rights upheld, namely Quebec, and the rest of the country doesn't. How can that be right? We need a constitutional exemption for those who are suffering right now and have a constitutional right that's not being applied since the government sought this extension.
Would you not, though, Maria Rankin, agree that the government hasn't been around very long and maybe wants to do its own work in terms of consulting to craft what kinds of guidelines make sense?
Yes, I'm sensitive to that difficulty that we're in as a result of the Conservatives doing nothing until July and leaving us in this situation. I accept that that's a problem. That's why the constitutional exemption gives us at least some way out where Quebec isn't in one category and the rest of the country in another. That's intolerable in a country like Canada.
Well, and we'll see whether the Supreme Court goes along with that case that was made by government lawyers. Sean Casey, back to you. The Conservatives set up that expert panel before the election. You know, they didn't work throughout the election, but they did finish the report. Will your government make that public so that we can see what that panel came up with?
We absolutely will. When the report was presented, it was presented in English only. It's been sent out for translation. When the translation comes back, it will be made public. It's absolutely our intention to do that. The work that was commenced by the previous government was a far cry from what we asked for in our motion to actually have the parliamentarians do their work. But admittedly, it was a start. It was a good start. Right. But we're still 6 months away from being where we need to be.
Okay, so who else do you need to talk to? What else do you need to do? Because that group of people traveled across the country talking to different people. What else would you like to see in terms of consultations over if you get the 6 months?
The most important piece is with the provinces. There are areas of mixed jurisdiction between health and justice, and there needs to be leadership from the federal government working with the provinces so that there can be certainty for families, for patients, and for doctors.
Just to be clear, though, you know, there are some people that argue that the Supreme Court decision, the Carter decision, has sort of guidelines included in it, including the BC Civil Liberties Association. Would your government still want to put a framework around that decision? Did you want to put legislation in place, or would you just let the Supreme Court decision stand and dictate the terms of it?
That will come out of this entire process. I do expect that there will be legislation. There will certainly be legislation at the provincial level. I do expect that there will be legislation at the federal level. But all of the end result will only happen once all of these discussions, once all the testimony, and once all the analysis takes place. So let's not prejudge the outcome. The fact is that in order for us to deal with something this complex, this nuanced, this personal, that has so many legislative, policy, and moral angles to it, we need to proceed deliberately.
Okay,
I don't.
Yes, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
I don't
Mary Rankin.
disagree with Mr. Casey on that point, but I think Canadians have to understand that a unanimous Supreme Court of Canada said people have this right. They have a constitutional right. Now we're simply talking, and they provided very specific conditions for the exercise of that right. So we're not here to talk about whether to. We're talking about how to.
Yeah, you could judge whether it was very specific, right? I mean, some of the language inside that decision was things like grievously ill people. I mean, you would have to define what that would mean. Right?
I agree, but the doctors' associations have done that. The College of Physicians in Ontario have already done that.
Yes.
There's many people that have already put meat in those bones. It's a question of moving on in the how to, not the whether to.
But do you not think, as Sean Casey's saying there, that the federal government needs to sort of patch that all together so it makes sense?
There needs to be this time, but I'm saying in the meantime, the way to handle the suffering that's going on amongst people right now is to provide constitutional exemptions.
Last word to you, Michael Cooper.
Well, I think, as I say, we just need to proceed cautiously, and I think that all members of the committee need to have an open mind. It is a very complicated issue. I don't think there is an easy answer, and with respect to the decision itself, I would beg to differ with Murray. I think there's a lot to be fleshed out, which is what the committee is going to get to work on. Okay, we'll leave it there, gentlemen. Thank you. I appreciate you debating this sensitive topic very respectfully. Thanks. Sean Casey, Michael Cooper. Nice to meet you, Michael Cooper, and Murray Rankin. A bit later, we're going to hear from two